Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to express my grave concern about Russian aggression and interference in our political system. My concerns have been compounded over the last several weeks by the response to these allegations by President Trump and his administration. First, let's step back for a moment. We know that the Russian Federation is an adversary of the United States. That's without question. Vladimir Putin is what I like to call a 24-hour bad guy. Lots of other ways to express it, but that's one way. And there's not a moment of the day when he isn't using his power to undermine our nation's interests and the interests of freedom and democracy across the globe. We know that the Russian regime kills journalists, jails and silences their critics, and commits war crimes in places like Syria and Ukraine. Russia meddles in elections throughout the Western world. Mr. Putin has a warped worldview. His view is that the freedom and democratic rights of tens of millions of people in Europe should be subject to the interests of a few in the Kremlin because those countries lie within Russia's supposed sphere of influence. The work done by our intelligence agencies indicates that Russia meddled in our election with the intent of aiding President Trump. We know that now. In January, our intelligence agencies concluded, we assess Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered an influence campaign in 2016 aimed at the U.S. presidential election. Russia's goals were to undermine public faith in the U.S. democratic process, denigrate Secretary Clinton, and harm her electability and potential presidency. We further assess Putin and the Russian government developed a clear preference for President-elect Trump, unquote. That's what our intelligence agencies tell us. And I'm quoting verbatim from that basic finding. President Trump's refusal to accept the assessment of our intelligence agencies was deeply concerning, and that's an understatement. My concerns were compounded by the fact that President Trump ran on the most pro-Russian platform in modern history. Since President Trump has taken office, he's harshly criticized our allies from Australia to Mexico, yet when it comes to Russia's provocations and war crimes, President Trump is silent. This deference that President Trump shows to Mr. Putin is troubling when combined with Russia's meddling in our election. It raises profound questions that need answers. That's why I strongly support the establishment of an independent commission to investigate Russia's interference in our political system, and I believe that the Justice Department must appoint a special counsel to investigate this matter as well. What the American people need to know once and for all is at least three things. Number one, what specific actions Russia took to aid President Trump during the election. Number two, whether U.S. persons had knowledge of or were involved in these actions. And finally, number three, whether President Trump has financial entanglements with Russians associated with the Putin regime. You could probably add other questions, but I think they're the three basic questions we have to answer. So this is a grave problem with substantial national security implications. And my constituents, I'm sure it's the case in every other state, they agree. Just since January the 1st, more than 80,000 Pennsylvanians have written to my office about Russia. That's 80,000 Pennsylvanians. These are thoughtful letters from Pennsylvanians who are so concerned about this issue that they took the time to write. A constituent from Cumberland County, right in the middle of our state, wrote, quote, "I'm bothered by the reports of Russia trying to interfere with our democracy. I'm particularly bothered by a lack of transparency in the administration with news reports of A.G. Sessions undisclosed contact with Russia. Russia is having the effect they wanted by shaking confidence in our system, unquote. That's a constituent from Cumberland County. Another constituent from Northampton County, along the eastern side of our state, just north of Philadelphia. This constituent wrote, and I'm quoting, "All politics aside, the investigation about Russia's action is a concern to our republic. Ultimately, it does not matter whether our elected officials are Democrats or Republicans, but it does matter that we all always put America's best interests first," unquote, from Northampton County, Pennsylvania. Mr. President, if the warnings from the U.S. intelligence community and the pleas from 80,000 plus Pennsylvanians aren't enough, then let's look at the numerous credible reports of contact between Russian officials and the Trump team. This body of reporting grows every day, and I'd ask consent to have this document entitled Summary of Credible News Reports on Trump's Campaign's Russia Ties, unquote. That's the name of it. I'd ask that that document be made part of the record.
Without objection.
Now, this summary is an illustrative list of many of the credible reports that are out there. Let's review just a few of the reports that have come to light since our intelligence agencies released their assessment. In November of 2016, the president's spokesman said, quote, at that time President-elect, the president-elect's spokesman said, and I'm quoting, "The campaign had no contact with Russian officials," unquote. Yet the Russian deputy foreign minister had stated that, quote, "there were contacts during the campaign," unquote. And on January 19th, the New York Times reported that the communications of President Trump's former campaign manager, Paul Manafort, his former foreign policy advisor, Carter Page, and his longtime associate, Roger Stone, were under investigation for contacts with the Russians. So reported the New York Times. Yet, despite that, President Trump continued to say for weeks that all of these reports about an investigation and contacts with Russian officials were so-called fake news. We have learned that the Trump administration's dismissals of these investigations and reports do not align with the facts. It seems that the administration has a strategy for all of these allegations: dodge and deceive, dodge and deceive. After all the dodging and deceiving, sometimes we finally get admissions of the truth. And again, the facts are disturbing and have meaningful national security implications. Here's an example of how these contacts may have actually changed policy. This past summer, ABC's George Stephanopoulos asked President Trump, quote, "Then why did you soften the GOP platform on Ukraine?" unquote. Candidate Donald Trump responded, quote, "I wasn't involved in that. Honestly, I was not involved," unquote. In early March, USA Today reported that then Trump advisors Carter Page and J.D. Gordon met with Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak at the Republican convention. In an interview with CNN, Mr. Gordon said that the effort to remove support for lethal security assistance to Ukraine from the Republican Party platform was done expressly to fulfill the wishes of then candidate Trump. Now, it's not uncommon for foreign officials to attend conventions. It is uncommon and completely, totally inappropriate for them to use that platform to shape our nation's policies by a change in a party platform. The dodging and deception continues. After insisting during his confirmation hearing that he had no contacts with Russian officials, it was reported that Attorney General Sessions, who was a top leader in President Trump's campaign, did indeed meet with the Russian ambassador. There's nothing to hide about a meeting with a foreign ambassador. That's part of our job as senators, as Attorney General Sessions was then, a member of the United States Senate. For example, in 2013, I met with the Russian ambassador to advocate for Pennsylvania families torn apart, by the Russian government's ban on international adoptions. And I was there with a significant group of other senators from both parties. But why would Mr. Sessions provide incorrect information to the Judiciary Committee, and why wouldn't he immediately correct the record? That's a question that we have to ask, and that's a question that deserves an answer. Finally, there's the issue of President Trump himself. We know that for many years he's expressed an interest in doing business in Russia. In 2008, Mr. Trump's executive vice president for acquisitions and development in his business said, quote, "Russians make up a pretty disproportionate cross-section of a lot of our assets. Say in Dubai, and certainly with our project in Soho and anywhere in New York, we see a lot of money pouring in from Russia," unquote. So, Mr. President, if one takes all of these reports together, plus the ones I've entered into the record and won't review in detail here today, you have to ask yourself, what's going on? What's going on with all of this information? That's why my constituents and I have questions. That's why we need an independent commission and a special counsel in the Justice Department, or appointed by the Justice Department. The administration owes the American people answers. We cannot allow my constituent Pam's warnings to come to fruition. We cannot allow Russia to exploit political differences to shake confidence in our democratic system. The United States has a proud tradition of rule of law and checks and balances. These are things that distinguish us from the autocratic and corrupt regimes around the world. The longer it takes to get to the bottom of this, the bottom of these questions, the longer it will be until we can get back to advancing meaningful policies to resist Russian aggression and stand with our European allies. We need to make a commitment to maintaining and expanding sanctions on Russia for a variety of malign activities. Number one, the cyber attack on our elections. Number two, meaning the Russians, indiscriminate bombing of civilians in support of the Assad regime in Syria. Third, their unabated support for separatists in eastern Ukraine. And fourth, the Russians' continued illegal annexation of Crimea. Mr. President, the American people and the people of Pennsylvania as well have had enough of dodge and deceive when it comes to these issues. They want answers, and the only way to get them is by way of an independent commission and a special counsel. The President and every Republican and every Democrat in the House and the Senate, in all of Congress, we need to say once and for all, clearly, definitively, unequivocally, that we will never, never allow this to happen again, and then work together to make that a reality. Mr. President, I would yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will